Hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about content, which is something that's come up just a smidge during Mobilism so far, but I think it's something that maybe we don't talk about quite enough still in the web community. And I think especially amongst crowds like this, which tend to be, I know a lot of you are, say, front-end devs, and some of you are designers. And I think that there's a lot that if you knew about in content, and if you kind of took the time to deal with content, it would really benefit you and benefit the projects that you work on as well. So the reason I think that a lot of times when we don't know about our content, it causes us some problems, is that I think sometimes we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We tend to want everything right now. That's why we're at a conference like this. We want our responsive sites launched. We want design decisions being made in the browser. We want our responsive image problems figured out. And we're spending a lot of time talking about the future, talking about how we need to be designing for it. And we get really excited about that. And that's valid, and that's a good use of our time. But sometimes I think that eagerness to talk about technical implications and solutions is kind of holding us back. Because while we're talking about performance, while we're sitting around being obsessed about page weight on our personal portfolio sites, our clients, our bosses, they're making decisions to do things like this. I know that yesterday Dave talked a little bit about this, about the door slam, and about how you get organizations who are making these obviously really crappy decisions about free apps, right? Everybody needs a free app to download, and that should just take over your screen. And so a lot of times what's happening is we are not really part of these conversations when these decisions are being made. And it doesn't really matter whether you think less or SaaS is better if this decision is made before you even get in the room. And so I've been there. I worked on a project a couple of years ago, probably 3 years ago now, with the state of Arizona, which is where I used to live. And when I worked with the state of Arizona, they had a pretty tremendous problem with mobile. The problem was that they had allowed a third party to build them a mobile site for free, as long as they could advertise on it. And that mobile site turned out to have about 1/20th of the content that the regular site had, because they had no way to get the content in the database from the regular site over into this app-like mobile experience that this company had built. And the only way that they could solve that problem at the time was this, which isn't really a solution at all. What it says to me is not just the door slam problem of I'm putting my organizational goals before my users' goals, but actually it's the problem of we can't fix our website, so here's 3 shitty options. Which is pretty much what this says to me. It says, you know what, things are really broken underneath here, so we're just going to put some paper over it and hopefully it'll be okay and kind of close our eyes. So what's underneath? What is underneath that terrible door slam? In my experience, what lies underneath is what I have started calling the spaghetti content, which is really just like spaghetti code in that it's this mess of stuff that has been there for a long time, that people have been adding to and changing and updating for years, without ever really thinking about the whole. What you have is a mess. It's unruly, it's unpredictable. It's things that people just have been tossing up and tossing up and tossing up until you have something that is completely snarled and nobody wants to touch it. Our clients don't want to fix this. The people we work with who are responsible for content, they're busy talking about content marketing now. They want to just make more of it. They don't want to go back and fix this. Hell, I do this for a living and I don't necessarily want to go back and fix this because it is a pain. And so we close our eyes, we paper over it, we try to move forward with a snazzy little homepage redesign, a responsive site that's maybe 5 or 6 pages, an app that we've tried to force people to download, and we leave this stuff lingering underneath. I used to get really frustrated about the way the organizations I was talking to were looking at mobile. I used to get really frustrated and think that these people just didn't understand mobile. They just didn't understand, right? We've talked a lot about mobile context during this conference. I know Kenneth talked a lot about, it's always something with public transport, right? They're always running for a train. I'm like, why don't clients get that it's so much broader than that? And then I realized something. And what I realized is that it wasn't actually about mobile. The reason that we had these shallow solutions was actually much more about fear. It was about organizations that are scared of the way that mobile and the way the web has changed things for them. They're scared of the disruption that's caused for them. And so the less I saw people who were trying to do something terrible to their users or were trying to do something terrible with mobile, and the more I saw some breathless CMO somewhere who is terrified of having to change things inside their organization in order to make mobile work. And so when I saw that, what I realized is that we, and I say this very broadly, we, people who work on websites, this is our job to be doing something about. It's not just about making the sites that are handed to us to do, but it's about pushing for solutions that can be deeper, that aren't going to be so shallow. And I don't think we're doing that quite often enough yet. I think too often, we, the people who were, just a few minutes ago, talking about all of these different techniques we could use to increase performance on our personal sites and our pet projects, we're sitting by. A lot of times we're rolling our eyes, right? Like we see, oh my God, yeah, those door slams, it's terrible. We know it's terrible. But are we actually changing the way we see our jobs? Are we changing the way that we work? A lot of times I think we're still doing this. We are doing the same old agency song and dance. I see a lot of people who do that. Even if you don't necessarily work in an agency, even if you work within an organization, what you end up with is this scenario where you're basically trying to sell people on a comp. You're trying to sell people on a thing. You're trying to go in there and say that this is going to be this shiny object that I will unveil to you, as opposed to talking about the ways in which this thing, this website, actually shapes and affects the organization. We're treating the web still like it's an addendum to the business, as opposed to just fundamentally part of the business itself. Or we get really tired of that shit, because that's tiring. And we get out. And I've had a lot of friends who have made the decision to go join startups. And there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to work in a place with a ping pong table and a kegerator. I get it. Who doesn't want that? But there's only so many of us who can go off and build something new and sparkly and fun. There's only so many of us who can start from scratch. I want to talk about some hard truths today. Hard truths about the kind of work that we do and what is it that actually makes it difficult. Because most of you probably aren't going to run off and join a startup. Most of you are probably working with organizations that are messy, that are real, that are frankly average. And those organizations need a lot of help. Because the web's complex. And when we don't want to accept that, we don't want to deal with that, we can't really help those people. So we need people who are willing to sort out complexity. I think the UK government's digital service has done a great job of talking about this. They've been going through a huge initiative from the highest levels to rethink how they look at digital services in the UK. It's not about making websites. It's about how do we make things that are going to serve the British people. And they put together some design principles about that. Number 4 is maybe my favorite. It says, making something look simple is easy. Making something simple to use is much harder, especially when the underlying systems are complex. But that's what we should be doing. And so what they've done so far, amongst other projects underway, is gov.uk, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen because it's been all over the place recently. It's a single site for all of UK government, and it's taken over what used to be hundreds of different sites about hundreds of different little topics. And they've cleaned it all up and made one extremely simple to use, responsive site with all of this information. Everything from registering a vehicle, to maternity leave, to paying your taxes. And this is an ongoing initiative that they have underway. Is how do they make digital service something that is intrinsic to the government and make sure that the sites they build put the people of the UK first. This is complicated. This is difficult work. We spend a lot of time talking about things that aren't as complicated. And I know, because I do it too. I am the editor of A List Apart, which I'm sure some of you read. And we recently did a website redesign. It's been years in the making. And some people love it, and some people hate it. But regardless of what you think about it, this is simple. I mean, it's a fun project to work on. I get to work with a few people who I know well, who share the same dedication to producing good content that I do. People who are, happy to talk to one another. We have a manageable amount of content. We know what we're publishing. It felt hard sometimes. I mean, like, anytime you have to make a thing, it's hard. But in the grand scheme of things, this is cake. This is designing for ourselves. I think Matt talked a little bit about that when he was talking about responsive images. A lot of times, we work on projects that are really for ourselves. There's a lot of things that we need to be working on that aren't so simple. This is what a ballot often looks like in the United States. Voting in the United States is notoriously confusing. I don't know if any of you remember our 2000 presidential election, but it made some news. So we have a history of challenges getting information to people voting and making sure people know how to vote correctly. Most of the world, most of the things that we interact with, they're a lot more like voting than they are like our side projects and industry darlings and startups and vanity projects. Those things actually make up a pretty small percentage of what we're working on. So what I want to talk more about today are helping those organizations that are doing complex things that are not simple at all, get better and get prepared for everywhere they need to go. People like this. This is actually some information about how you would apply to go to the technical university in Munich. Higher ed is a great example for confusing websites with lots of content that don't make sense. Pretty much can always go to higher ed for that. What this actually is, just a couple of the initial steps if you were going through their site to try to figure out how you would apply there. And when you start out here on this online bewerben, which is how you would apply online, it's really just an explanation with some screenshots so you know where you should click on the page where you actually apply, because if you get to that page without those directions with the things in red, you would never figure it out. It's also important to note when you do get to this page, wie melde ich an, so how do I apply? It's up in the right-hand corner, there is an arrow that points down that flashes, so you know that that's where you start. Because that was the most effective way that they could figure out how to tell people what to do to start applying. And then finally, if you go through a few different steps, you can get to the first form where you start filling things out. Stuff like this is legitimately complicated. The information that they need from you takes some time to fill out. And I think no matter where you're from, rich kids with time and tutors and parents involved, they're always going to figure this out. The system can stay kind of crappy and it's never going to be a problem for them. If the mobile experience sucks, that's okay. They have other ways to access the content. But when you have complex, bewildering processes, and you have a lot of people who are using all kinds of different devices, especially, and I don't have any good stats on this for Europe, but I know in the United States, 60% of Americans who make less than $30,000 a year use their mobile device as their primary way to access the web. They don't have home broadband. I think I just flubbed that stat. I think it's 60% do not have home broadband. And then a large portion of those only use the web on a mobile device. That is from a Pew Research study. And so we know also that kids, for example, are using their consoles quite often to access the web. These people need to be able to access complex things. And yet, most of what we're doing on mobile is still at a relatively shallow level. No matter where you go, whether it's here, where you would figure out information about paying your taxes here in the Netherlands, things are complex. And every single time, people with resources can hire an accountant. People with resources are going to be able to compare shopping online and get the best deal on a product. People who are relying only on a mobile device, people who maybe don't have access to as much information, people who don't have the time to sift through this stuff and try to sort it out, they're the ones who are getting left behind. People with resources are always going to work around a shitty system. People without them are going to hit a wall. And that wall is this. It's complex information made more challenging by changing laws, years of additions, stuff that's been tacked on over the years, endless modifications to content, all sitting on top of these aging, creaking platforms. So it's really difficult to go in and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to throw out some media queries. It'll be great. It'll be responsive. Because what you haven't been able to do is deal with that mess of content that's underneath. It doesn't solve that underlying problem of things that we've ignored for too long. So what I talk a lot about is that what we really need is some structure. We need to be thinking about our content in much more structured, organized ways. And there's other people who talk about this a lot as well. Stephen talked about this even a little bit yesterday in his talk. If we give our content structure, we can make sense of it. We can manage it. We can make it systematic and predictable. And that allows us to reflow and reformat it in different ways. It allows us to do more with it. It means that we can make responsive sites that go more than one layer deep. The thing is that this takes some work. It takes some things that sound easy, like writing in trim, compact language, breaking your content into modules. Because if you want to use, like, whether you think Flexbox is awesome or not, it relies on you having actual chunks of content to move around. It doesn't really work if everything is just one big lump. It requires breaking things into parts, labeling them, storing them. And so these things, I think, sound kind of easy at first glance, especially if you're used to being in charge of things like markup. Like, how you can do this in terms of like marking up content so it can move around the page, not that hard. It's kind of foundational. But I was talking recently to Luke Wroblewski. He gave a talk at the Content Strategy Forum, which is a conference I was at a few months ago. And he mentioned to me when I saw him last that he had pissed off a whole lot of content strategists. Because he said that. Well, yeah, structured content, that's foundational. I mean, that's just where you start if you're going to build something, right? And he's like, I don't see that as being strategic. And I think he's right. If you're starting from scratch, yeah, simply the right way. Get your content into an API. Why wouldn't you do that? Obviously, you would do that. Where the strategy comes in, where the work comes in, is that that doesn't just happen, especially not in the big, bumbling organizations that we're trying to help. Existing content is a huge mess, and it won't sort itself out without some work. It takes a lot. Rachel Levinger is a content strategist who works a lot on structured content and metadata issues, and she talks about what it takes, which is synthesizing a swath of sources, designing usable systems, changing organizations, training personnel, soothing egos, adjusting priorities, allaying fears, reallocating resources. It's strategic because it requires you to actually change an organization. I mean, you can give an organization this plan for their content that's going to be perfect, and you can give them a responsive design that's going to look beautiful, but they're not going to be able to keep that up unless they do all this other stuff as well. That's not quick, and that's not the kind of work that we all might be used to doing. Like, helping organizations slowly shift over time is maybe not the kind of thing you normally think of as being in your job description. And it'd be easy to say that those organizations that can't adapt, that they could just be left behind. Like, they don't have to adapt. They'll die out, right? And new organizations that are smarter and quicker will take their place. But I think the problem with that is that this is how a lot of our organizations are. And those organizations are serving people who need and deserve information. They deserve to be able to figure out how to pay their taxes or how to get a fair price. They don't deserve to hit a wall just because nobody was willing to take the time to make some change to sort out that content mess. So, if you want to get an organization thinking a little bit differently, the place to start, I think, is getting inside the content itself, which is something that I do with these beautiful, beautiful documents that Matt loves a lot, spreadsheets, where we will actually audit the content. We'll go through and look at all of the stuff that we have and actually look at all of it. Like, for real, what do we got? What have we been publishing since 1996 when we launched our first website? Where is all that information? Has it been updated? Like, ever? And then what are we going to do with this? Now, this is pretty beautiful, I know. It's the kind of stuff everybody wants to work on. In fact, a lot of people love content audits. Way back in 2002, Jeffrey Veen, who is one of the founders of Adaptive Path, called it a mind-numbingly detailed odyssey through your website. Does everybody want to sign up? At the time, he was talking about auditing content to pull it out of static pages and into a content management system. And at the time, 2002, it was kind of like, OK, well, somebody has to actually go through, figure out all the content that you have in all of these different pages, and extract it and dump it in. Now, I actually don't look at a content audit or at getting to know your content as something that's mind-numbing. I see it as something that's eye-opening. Because what it helps you understand is not just the content you have, which has some huge benefits we're going to talk about, but also what's happening in that organization that is going to make the things that you're designing break. And I mean that. When you start understanding the content that exists, you start seeing what an organization has been doing wrong for years. You start figuring out who has been making decisions. You start figuring out where the content is coming from. And that's information that you can use to have better conversations about how you're designing, and to have better conversations about what you really need to support. Conversations that you just wouldn't have if you didn't dig below the surface. So I'm going to talk about some ways that looking at your content is going to help you. The first one is just less crap, rather than trying to shoehorn everything in. I think both Dave and John yesterday talked about performance quite a lot. Now, and Matt, of course, today talking about images. Having a lot of content on a website isn't necessarily going to slow it down like, an Oakley size amount of images, but it's going to slow people down. Even if the content loads quickly, it doesn't read quickly. Loads and loads of crap is very difficult for a user to wade through, which might not be as expensive in terms of a data plan, but how much is their time worth? Don't we care about that? So when you go through your content, you can make some substantial reductions, I think, on most sites. Gov.uk went from 70,000 plus pages to about 3,000 pages. You might not get those kinds of results, but if they can get rid of that much content, I bet you have some things sitting around that you don't need also. In fact, actually, a few months ago, I was working with a large company in the US, kind of like big, publicly traded company. And what we did is we went through all of their content in preparation for them wanting to go responsive. They had said, we have a couple microsites that we launched for these different initiatives that are responsive, and it's time. We're going to do the whole thing. Their current site was about 6,000 or 7,000 pages of content, which is actually not that big for a company of that size. Just says something. And they didn't know where it all came from because it was from 7 different divisions of the company, and everybody had independent access to update things, and some of the content might be really, really old, and nobody really knew. There've been a lot of facelifts over the years, there's a lot of questions. What we were able to do is dig through that content and say, you know what? About 40% of this, you don't need. If you do that before you work on a design, if you do that before you start talking about CMSs, before you start talking about implementation, all of a sudden your job gets a hell of a lot easier. And it's really just about asking some questions. It's about asking what you got. How much of it do you have? Where is it? What topics does it cover? What are the things that we actually have on this site in the first place? And does it fit your strategy? Which, if you don't know what your strategy is, then you might have some other problems. But is it useful for users? Does it help your organization, your business goals? Does it support your brand? What's it doing there? Does it have a purpose? And is it any good? Is it up to date? Is it well written? Is it organized? Is it accessible? Then you can start getting rid of things. Things that are rotten, which are redundant, outdated, trivial. I think that it was actually coined by Lou Rosenfeld, probably like a decade or more ago, for an evaluation technique for what can you just get rid of. Or you can get rid of things that are fluff, wordiness, marketing speak, things that sound good but aren't really doing a job. By asking, like, is every piece of our content actually performing a purpose? Or is it just words filling up space? Is your content working for you? When you take the time to do that, there's some short-term stuff that I've talked a little bit about that I think is important. Because when you're only having to design for and support content that actually matters, you're going to spend a lot less time on the content migration issues. You're spending a lot less time on those sort of like shoehorning in issues later on. And of course, less crap for users to deal with. Less stuff they don't need, slowing them down, making them leave your site, making them frustrated. But there's also a long-term win. The long term is that when you start talking about content early and you start going through some of those things, because you start understanding how it got there in the first place, it opens up conversations that are probably long overdue. Conversations about priorities, roles, responsibilities, and you start talking about that stuff before launch, not when you've already made all the decisions about what you're going to build. Not only is getting rid of content a useful benefit of actually going through it and understanding what you have, but after you've done that, you'll also have an idea of representative content. And this is something that Stephen talked about yesterday, just kind of touched on. I should thank him for teeing this up for me. Representative content. He said, design without content is designing with your eyes closed. Now, you've probably heard other people talk a little bit about this by now if you've been following responsive design. People are talking about things like designing from the content out. That's something that Mark Bolton talks a lot about. How, you don't really know what your canvas size is. You don't really know where something might be displayed. But you do, if you care about it, know your content. And so if you start with your content, if you design with your content, then you have one known, you have one piece of information that you can feel certain about, and that's what you can base your decisions on. The thing I always wonder about that, though, is that designing from the content out makes me say, well, which content? Even on a site like gov.uk, where they got it down from 70,000 to 3,000 pages, you don't have enough people to sit down and make individual decisions about how to design 3,000 pages of content. You need to be a little bit more systematic. So the question is, of course, which content? Even 3,000 pages is still a lot. Even 300 pages is still a lot to make decisions about. So how do you figure out what content you should be designing for? Well, when you know your content, you're able to figure out types of content that you have, representative content. You can get things organized in such a way that you're not trying to guess where stuff's going to go or which templates things are going to use or throw everything into the general template. What you're able to do is make smarter decisions about how content fits into a design. It's really just a set of content. It's like one example of each content type you need to support. So what you do is you find the patterns in your content, you find the ways that it's similar, and you make sure you have a set of content that reflects the variety of content you'll have. Because realistically, it would be great to say that you're going to do content first, right? Like, content first is awesome. Yeah, I'm going to have all the content first. But that's probably only going to happen at a small scale. You can say, yes, you're going to have all your content first for, the Mobilism website. It's yes, OK, we need to have some information about the event. We need to have speaker bios. We have a pretty limited set of things. You could realistically get all that content prepared before you started designing. But on a large site, for a large organization, a big, messy organization, it's not saying, well, you have to have a final document with 3,000 pages of content in it. It's saying, well, we need to know what's the shape of stuff that we're going to have to deal with. What are all the different kinds of things that are going to cause us problems later that we can account for now? It's just about saying, OK, well, we have these kinds of things. We support these here 4 kinds of content, these 4 types. They're all loosely the same. Well, what do they look like? What are the pieces and parts that make them up? How are they shaped? What makes them distinct from one another? Are you talking about an interview? A feature story? I don't know, a product? A bio? An erotic poem? Maybe a manifesto? What are all the things that you're publishing, whatever it is that they are? What are all the natural pieces that make them whole? What are the things that we need to know about them? That's going to give you what I usually refer to as content types. So based on those patterns in your content, shape, its purpose, the chunks that it has in it. They start categorizing like content together. Especially if you're going through old existing stuff, you have to start finding those parallels between different areas because they don't necessarily exist. Like they haven't been built into this old site from the early aughts, right? So you have to figure that out. You have to start putting things that look like one another into the same category and then figuring out what's important to support for them. And you can get more or less granular on this. This isn't something where you necessarily have to have like 47 different content types with discrete content requirements. It's much more about getting some rough ideas of the different things that you need. And then I always look at having some content requirements, so defining which attributes a content type needs. So formats, character limits, fields that you would have. So it could be things like, okay, well, in order to publish an article, you have to have a title and a short description and like body content. Or you also have to have an author. Or maybe you don't. It depends, right? It depends on what your situation is, but it's those decisions. Somebody has to make the decision about what is it that constitutes an article. And if nobody does that at the early stage by looking at the content itself and looking at the organizational need, those decisions get left to guesswork down the line. And that guesswork, like all guesswork, has a pretty decent chance of being wrong and then turning into rework. So doing this is going to help you map your content logically to things like templates or pattern libraries. You can have a systematic look at where your content needs to be, rather than letting it all rot in generic pages. One of my big pet peeves is when like 8,000 pages of content all fall into the same template, and every piece of content turns into this big blob, and then you're trying to port it over to be ready for some sort of small screen thing, whether that is an app or a mobile site or a responsive site, and all you're really doing is just putting everything into a narrow field, and everything just scrolls indefinitely. You can have smarter solutions for it when you've taken the time to go through it and categorize it. But of course, there's a long-term win here. When every piece of content has a purpose, like has a reason to exist, when every type of content is there because it's tied to an organizational goal, like we publish articles because, and you actually have an answer to that, you're less likely to end up with stuff that you don't need later. Like people are less likely to produce content that doesn't serve the organization because every kind of content that fits in the system has to serve the organization by design. So people are more likely to stay on track and not just post stuff up because they can. And the third way that understanding your content really helps you is it allows you to rely on systems and not just pages. And this gets pretty important when you are dealing with lots of different varying screen sizes and things you can't anticipate. Even, for example, things like navigation. Brad Frost has talked a lot about dealing with navigation on responsive sites. And he says that, a complex multi-level navigation is going to be difficult no matter what way you slice it. It's just hard. There's lots of different examples of people trying out different things, but it's just really damn difficult to figure out how you're going to organize your navigation when you have a big, large, like corporate site or university site. And so people are making all kinds of interesting decisions about how to deal with that. This is from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. They did some fun stuff where I am actually on the benefits of joining page in the prospective student section. But this is what I see when I look at this on my phone. Oh, there it goes. There. All of that was navigation right until that benefits of joining part that's down with some significant scrolling. Now, I know people know how to scroll. But the fact that they couldn't figure out any other way to get people to be able to access their content and move through different parts of the site, except for having that much navigation up at the top, tells me that they have not figured out their content problems. Structured content can really help you with those kinds of things because structured content allows you to do different things. It allows you to have more interconnection between content, which allows you to rely less on navigation. So the more that there's natural inherent connectedness amongst content, the less you have to have the sort of like big overwhelming menu that comes out of nowhere. You do that when you model your content. Modeling your content is defining your content system, how the different pieces of content work together. What are the relationships between the kinds of content that you have? So when I went back and was working on a very long-term effort to fix some of the problems with the state of Arizona's tourism site, it was about figuring out that people make plans to visit a place in Arizona based off of the city, that something's in, and they'd be looking for, say, a national park near a city or a hotel in a city, and that there are these natural connections between what they were looking for. And it's understanding what those connections are, and then building those into the system that allow you to have that content be interconnected and not just accessible with a big, huge main navigation. It's about having things like metadata. Metadata sounds super nerdy, but it's so helpful to have some metadata to your content, because it just gives you some additional information about what your content is, like its topic or when it was authored, and it allows you to make some rules that go with it. So you can have metadata that's exposed to the front end that like people can see and use to filter and sort themselves. But the real magic is that it allows you to have more power. It allows you to have different things happen when you're designing. So you can use metadata to decide how and where to display content, and to control how different combinations of content modules or related items or excerpts are going to appear. It allows you to kind of prioritize content differently in different circumstances. It allows you to extract things in different ways, so to be able to include different types of content that are related, whether you're on a large screen or a small screen. And it allows you to use something like Flexbox to change around, or to use JavaScript to change around where something is going to appear on the page. Something that you're not really able to do if you don't have any metadata behind your content that tells it what's relevant to what. It allows you to do all kinds of things that have been very useful for a long time on places like shopping sites, like faceted search. Like you wouldn't be able to buy shoes online without faceted search. But we haven't really done a lot of things like that for content that's not products. Allowing people to search and sort and filter by multiple different categories at once, something that's pretty rare outside of the product sphere, and it's something that a lot of our content could be categorized that way if it were structured. It also makes those related content thingies like actually relevant, because I know a lot of the time when you see related content, that's like an immediate sign that it's garbage you don't want to look at, as opposed to something like this, which is BBC Food. What they're able to do, because all of their content is structured, is allow you, when you go to a recipe, to explore other recipes that you would legitimately be interested in. So whether you came to this recipe, which is for, I think it's masala chicken, whether you came to this recipe for masala chicken because you have chicken in the fridge and you know you need to cook it tonight, or you came to this recipe for masala chicken because you really love this chef or this show that she's on, you can then easily go find more recipes that are about chicken or more recipes that are from this show, all based on the fact that they have structured content. And none of that requires these heavy, bloaty navigation systems. All of that is simply built in. So the short-term win for this is that it makes it a lot easier to access content in a range of different ways, right? So you don't have to lay out every damn page and build in like manual links to all of this other stuff. All that stuff becomes interconnected naturally. But of course, in the long term, the benefit is that content becomes a system, and it's a system that supports the business, supports the organization, rather than it being just a thing that's tied to a specific destination. The more that people see their content as part of a system and stop seeing their content as just my pages that I post to the internet, the better they are about following along with the organization's strategy. The less they just put up every press release since 1994 that nobody ever wanted online. It also helps to get people collaborating. So they stop posting whatever, whenever, wherever, and they start saying, if I do this here, that's going to affect this person over here. We should make sure we're on the same page about things. And it starts making people have conversations that they should have been having a long time ago and have simply avoided. But, okay. So organizations are kind of screwed up. You guys probably knew that if you've had a job before. Probably know how big organizations can get kind of weird. So I want to spend just a couple minutes here at the end talking about how some of this can help you, like why some of this is important for you. I mean, you just want to make some websites, right? But I think that there's kind of a cupcake involved. There's a little bit of a treat involved if this is something that you take on. Because I think we work really hard. I think that we go to events like this because it's important for us, like we feel like it's important for us to get better at what we do. You all give a shit, right? So if you care this much about your work, you care this much about like this craft of web, Don't you want that stuff to go deeper? Don't you want to stop having these conversations like, well, we were really excited about that project, but then my boss decided that all we needed to do was have this app instead, but nobody really wants it. So we never got to do any of that cool stuff that I learned about. Or these conversations, which is where you sell people on what the site's going to look like based off of a comp, because we couldn't get the client to agree to not see comps in that way. We couldn't get them to agree to dealing with it in the browser. So, we just did it the old-fashioned way, and then the client's pissed because it doesn't look like the comps, because things never look exactly like the comps, because you ran into all of this content 4 months down the line that completely broke your expectations of what you were going to get. I think a lot of times the broken content that we have and the broken organizations that are underneath, they cause us a lot of stress. They make us feel like our work never really turns out the way we wanted. It's always that little bit of disappointment. I think that we have both an obligation to help the organizations we work with make things better in deeper ways for more people, and we have an obligation to try to make this stuff deeper for us. You don't want your best ideas to end up in a desk drawer because they couldn't be implemented, because nobody was willing to go through and sort out the mess underneath. So we have to look at our content and really look at it and be willing to say that, yeah, you know what? That's a little bit of my job too. You guys don't all have to start doing all of the content work I do. It's important to have people who are specialists in different areas. But the more that you get comfortable with the idea that, yes, that content is probably very messy, and also, yes, you have a role to play in sorting it out, I think you're going to be more satisfied with the work that you put out. And this is also the time to deal with this mess. We have people who are really excited about mobile right now. We have people who are like, oh my God, we got to deal with mobile. We need a mobile solution. We have been avoiding mobile since 2007. This is the year we are going to really deal with this. This is the time to get people to change practices in more substantial ways. Because ultimately, this is about making more content more accessible for everybody. It's not about saying like, ooh, look at our really pretty responsive homepage that we built. It's about saying, how do we take that and apply it to everything that we do? How do we make sure that everybody has access to all of our content, however they need it, wherever they are? So with that, that's what I have for you. I'd like you to go on and look at your content. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We are going to do just a couple questions quick before the break, if that's cool.
Sure.
All right.
So like
there was actually a lot of comments about the food, the recurring food theme. Some people are hungry, but then that was before you showed the moldy corn, so I don't know. They might be done
Sorry?
by now. So the content inventory thing, a lot of people were kind of curious about some of the things there. So if you, let's say you are one of those big, messy, spaghetti organizations, and you've got millions and millions of pages, or some of the content that you have is third-party, content. How do you handle that stuff with an audit? And is it even possible to go through 3 million pages?
Well, manually, probably not. I think one of the things that you have to think about whenever you're going to deal with content is that you're probably going to have to make some priorities. It's relatively easy. It still takes time. It's relatively easy to go through a few hundred pages of content, but honestly, anytime you get into thousands, it just takes time, and you may not have that much time. So when you're dealing with something that's at an incredibly large scale, I think it's much more about figuring out where the biggest problems are and starting there. If you have millions of pages of content, you probably have a bunch of people who are producing it. So it's about finding some allies in different parts of the organization who can help you with some of that, who can take on pieces and get them to champion pieces of that. And then it's also about figuring out, what's really most important for us to deal with. And actually, I've seen a lot of organizations that have like the millions of pages, or like, let's say maybe 100,000 pages. They actually, once you start looking at it, they can make some pretty swift decisions that are like, you know what? 20,000 of these pages are like press releases from pre-2000. Maybe we don't need them on our website anymore. And so sometimes you can start like making the, you take a broad look at first, and then you're able to be like, oh, okay, we can narrow this problem down a bit.
And how do you make that distinction that the older content, if let's say your thing is content, you're a content producing site and it's long form content, how do you make the distinction that that old stuff is no longer relevant and is no longer used in like, because a direct comparison with analytics could potentially be misleading, right? If like the hierarchy was crap and it was buried anyway, it could be something that users actually want, but it's not.
Well, and it very much depends on what kind of organization you are, right? Like, okay, if you're running a media site, you're going to have a very different set of goals and priorities than if you're running like an e-commerce site or some other kind of business. It totally depends. So if you have a media site, it might make a lot of sense to keep an archive of everything you've ever published, because that literally, like, that content literally is your business. If you are, if you are like a lot of organizations and you are more like, whatever, you sell a product, you sell a service, a lot of your content ends up being content people produced for various marketing purposes over the years, that content tends to get stale pretty fast. Like, nobody's saying that what, like, the New York Times should do is take their archives offline. But it's about understanding what it is that you have and figuring out systematic ways of dealing with it. So it's like having an archive strategy. But if you are able to look at like a small piece at a time, you can start mapping things like analytics information to the content and pulling in like, well, have people actually accessed this? And if they haven't accessed this, then you start asking why they haven't accessed this, which might be that like nobody can find it. But it is a lot of manual work. I think that's part of the deal with content, is that there's not a lot of easy answers, because content reflects people, and people are messy as hell.
I think that's come up a few times during the event, actually, too, the human thing being messy. That's good. It would be boring otherwise. So
Right.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.